All right. Yes, let's give the Lord a round of applause. God is so good, so faithful. Well, it is great to be with you here at Move. I'm so excited to be able to share with you tonight. And, you got to know me a little bit earlier, but I feel like one of the fastest ways to become friends is to tell an embarrassing story. So here's one of my most embarrassing moments of my entire life. So my husband and I, Mike, we were living in this darling older home in our city. We had been renting this house for a while, and we bought our first home. And so we were packing up this house that we'd been living in, and it was a darling little house. But like I said, it's old. It was charming, but it had all the noises, all the creaks. And so I had my many moments of feeling a little jumpy in the house. But this last evening that we were there, we had packed everything up. We were getting ready to move in the morning, and so it was late at night. All the boxes were ready to go into the moving van, and it was like 11, almost 11 at night. And so all of a sudden, we hear this outside of our bedroom door. Just like footsteps getting louder and louder and faster right outside of our door. So Mike, being the valiant husband that he is, he just looked at me real quick, and then he just slammed the door as hard as he could. And then we're looking back at each other, back and forth, not saying anything. And finally I was like, just grabbed him, and we ran into the walk-in closet. And we're like, okay, what are we going to do? And I just immediately grabbed my phone, and I called the police. I was like, there's somebody in our house. So I told the dispatch person, all of what I felt like was happening. And then hung up, and she said, okay, before I hung up, actually. She said, someone will be there in just a few minutes, just wait for them to knock on the door. So we stood there in the walk-in closet listening intently because I was convinced that there was an intruder in our house, and there was no noise whatsoever. So I'm starting to think, okay, maybe there's nobody in here, or maybe the intruder is like this, just completely still frozen outside of our door. I don't know. But it started to feel like maybe this was just a little bit of panic that had overtaken me. Well, pretty soon we hear a knock on the door, and my phone rang at the same time, and the dispatch person said, hey, the officers are outside your house. So Mike went out to go and let them in. And as he's going out there, I look down, and I realize I'm already starting to feel embarrassed. And I look down, and I realize I'm wearing the Christmas pants. Now, it is May, and I'm wearing these Christmas pants. These were these pajama pants that were massive. This sweet lady actually made Mike and I matching Christmas flannel pajama pants for our wedding. And the legs were like this big. I mean, they were huge. So I loved wearing them because I could like wrap them around several times. So it was like a blanket. But then I'm going, okay, these are very embarrassing. This is a very embarrassing outfit to be wearing in a very embarrassing situation when no one is probably in the house. So I just like looked out the door, and they're walking through with their flashlights, looking at everything. Finally, about 5, 6, 7 minutes later, they checked the whole house. They left, and Mike said, Carly, come here. You got to see what happened. So we walk out, and right outside of our bedroom door, I see a pile of flat cardboard moving boxes, the perfectly pristine ones that had never been opened before. So what had happened was my best friend had come over and brought a bunch of moving boxes and set them against the wall, and at 10:56, when the air conditioner popped on, then they went down one by one, making it sound like footsteps. So to this day, we call that story the box burglar story. The night that we didn't necessarily get robbed, but I was convinced of it. Oh my goodness. But I tell you that story because this is actually not all that abnormal for me to have anxiety absolutely hijack my brain. I can often very quickly get into anxious mode where I think of the worst case scenario, where I am a little bit irrational and I get stressed. And I would imagine that I'm probably not the only one that has struggled with anxiety or panic, right? I'm sure that there are actually many of you in the room that might struggle with anxiety on a regular basis, and I'm sure that all of us at one point or another have had a moment like that where we have gone to the worst case scenario from 0 to 100 real quick, and it felt like we couldn't see clearly, couldn't think clearly because anxiety was dominating our minds. And when we think about anxiety, I think it's helpful to read this from Sissy Goff, who is a therapist for kids and teens. She's a Christian counselor. And she says this, that anxiety causes us to overestimate the power of the problem and underestimate ourselves and our ability to cope. So anxiety makes the problem huge and makes us feel small. And that can feel really deflating. It can feel overwhelming, and if we live in cycles of anxiety for a long time, it can actually be incredibly defeating and exhausting and wearing. And many of you may find yourself in that kind of perpetual storm tonight. But I say to you, and I say to me, I need to hear this tonight too, that Jesus does not want us to live in a mode of trying to plan and prepare and try to problem solve our way to peace. But instead, we can find peace because of the presence of Jesus who is with us, even in the midst of the storms. The greatest gift is the presence of Jesus. And so tonight we're going to be looking at a scripture from Mark chapter 4, where the disciples had massive anxiety in this passage, and where they were living in the worst case scenario too, and how Jesus reminded them that it was his presence that would bring them peace. So let's read this together from Mark chapter 4, starting in verse 35. It says, later that day when evening came, Jesus said to them, let's cross over to the other side of the lake. They left the crowd and took him in the boat just as he was. Other boats followed along. Gale force winds arose, and waves crashed against the boat so that the boat was swamped. But Jesus was in the rear of the boat, sleeping on a pillow. They woke him up and said, "Teacher, don't you care if we're drowning?" He got up and gave orders to the wind, and he said to the lake, "Silence. Be still." The wind settled down, and there was a great calm. Jesus asked them, "Why are you frightened? Don't you have faith yet?" Overcome with awe, they said to each other, "Who then is this? Even the wind and the sea obey him." So let's unpack this scripture together. So before this, in Mark chapter 4, we read that Jesus has been on the side of the water. He's been teaching throughout the day. And there's been so many crowds that have come that because it was so dense with people, he had to actually get in a boat and go out into the water a little bit so everyone could see him and hear him. Well, then as the evening came, then he said to his disciples, "We're going to go across the lake." And across the lake was Gentile territory. Now, the disciples had been taught to avoid Gentiles because they were unclean and they were from the wrong side of the tracks, if you will. So they had been told to steer clear. And now Jesus is inviting them to go across the lake and to interact with people who they certainly normally would not interact with. So that already had to be a little bit anxiety-inducing, thinking like, what are we doing, Jesus? Why are you taking us over here? This is not what we're used to. But then they go at night. And I don't know about you, but it feels like anxiety and worry and fear always gets worse at night. So the disciples, they're in the boat, and the wind starts to pick up. And then there's some waves, and more come. And to the point that we read that there are gale force winds. And actually, when we look at the original language in the scriptures, this paints the picture of tornadoes on the water. I mean, how scary would that have been? If I were in the boat, I would have been freaking out too. And the disciples, they get into panic mode. I can just imagine them, trying to figure out what to do to problem solve and who's going to tie down the sails and who's dumping out the water out of the boat with the buckets. And they're yelling at each other. It's frantic, frenzy, panic. And all the while, Jesus is asleep. He's totally at peace. He's asleep with his head on a pillow, sawing logs. He's so sleepy and at peace. And I wish we knew the moment that one of the disciples said, wait a minute, where's Jesus? What's he doing? And they're like, oh my word, he is asleep. And they go over to him, and one of the disciples shouts out and says, Jesus, don't you care? Don't you care what's happening to us? We are about to drown. Don't you care? And I can't help but wonder if maybe some of you have felt that way too. Where maybe you're in the midst of a storm. Maybe you feel forgotten. And you say, you're feeling like, don't you care, God, that my family is falling apart? My parents are getting a divorce. And where are you, God? Don't you care? Maybe others of you are in the midst of a move, and you're having to move pretty soon and go to a new school, new friends, new city, and you're going, God, don't you care? This is ruining everything. Don't you care? Or maybe there's a relationship that has crumbled in your life. Maybe you didn't get into the college that you're hoping for, or made that team or that choir, and you're going, all the things that I prepared for are not happening. God, don't you care? Where are you in the midst of the storm? Why aren't you helping me? Don't you care? And if that's you, if you've been there, or maybe you're even crying out to God right now with that same kind of cry, please know, first of all, that Jesus can handle that. Jesus is not offended or put off by you. Jesus invites you to be honest and cry out to him. So secondly, I also want you to know that if that is you, that you are not alone. That there are many of us, myself included, and maybe I would guess many of the people around you, even your leaders, have had those moments where we've said, where in the world are you, God? I had a season of my life where anxiety felt absolutely crippling to me. About 10, 11 years ago, it was a season where I felt like I could not get out of the pit of anxiety, where fear had taken over. And it made me physically sick. And I remember just laying on my floor with my face in the carpet, just crying out to God and saying, God, please, please take this away from me. Please deliver me from this anxiety. With tears streaming down my face, just feeling like, why, God, why won't you take this away? Because I know that God can heal in an instant, and so I was feeling so, forgotten by God. Or abandoned by God, going, why do we read all these stories of restoration and healing in moments that in a flip of a switch, and you're not doing that for me? God, don't you care? But I continued to pray and cry out to God and just continue to ask for help and for healing and for restoration. I remember one evening in that season of my life, after I had been praying for months for help and healing, I went up to a camp, and I was representing the university where I was working at the time, and I sat in the back of the camp chapel, and I once again was crying out to God and asking for help. God, please take away this anxiety. And in that moment, God met me in a really unique way, where I had this picture in my mind of Jesus reaching out his hands and putting them on the sides of my face, like cupping my face in his hands and so tenderly looking into my eyes and saying, oh, Carly, I'm inviting you to know me. I'm inviting you to know me. And I had grown up in the church, and I had loved God my whole life, and I had such a desire to serve God and follow God and honor God with my life, but I had become so perfectionistic about my faith and so worried about failing or not representing God correctly or well that I had become paralyzed with fear. And in that moment, I felt like the Lord was saying, oh, Carly, this is all about relationship. It's not about to-do lists. I am so pleased with you, my daughter. So let's cultivate a friendship. And out of that friendship, you will find the peace that you're looking for. You will find fulfillment. And so hearing those words, I'm inviting you to know me, just ringing in my heart and my mind. That day was a turning point for me. And I'll tell you, it wasn't a light switch where all of a sudden the anxiety went away. But it was a shift of my perspective where I realized that God was with me in the midst of my anxiety, in the midst of my storm, and inviting me to shift my perspective. And so I just started to press in ways that weren't about checking off boxes, but just cultivating a friendship with Jesus. And slowly but surely, day by day, moment by moment, the Lord started me on a new healing journey. And I'm still on it. Sometimes I still struggle with anxiety. But I do feel like my perspective has been shifted because I know that the peace that I so desperately want is available with Jesus right now. It's not, Jesus isn't asking for my plans and my problem solving and my preparation and my perfection or my performance. Jesus is inviting me to rest. And through rest and surrender and open hands, I can experience peace. And I think that's what Jesus was inviting the disciples to that evening. Was to shift their perspective, to not look in the face of the storm and elevate the problem, but to look in the face of Jesus, who is the personification of peace. He is the absolute definition of peace. And so when they started to cry out to him in their anger and their frustration and their fear, first of all, he didn't actually respond to them right away, which I think is interesting, but he went to the storm first. And he said, silence, be still. And then he came to the disciples and he said, why are you so afraid? Do you still have no faith? And sometimes I think we can read that with a different tone of voice. I don't know if you've ever read this and heard more of this kind of tone, like, well, why are you so afraid? Where's your faith? Kind of this like judgy Jesus vibe. But I don't think that is at all what Jesus sounded like, because I believe that Jesus is, yes, the personification of peace. He's the definition of peace, and he is also full of compassion. So in that moment, I think so tenderly, he said to them, why are you so afraid? He was inviting them to name their fear, to not suppress it, but actually to address it, because he knew that their fear was robbing them of the peace that he had available for them. So he was saying, what is it? What's underneath this franticness and this panic and this anxiety? What is the fear? Are you afraid to fail? Are you afraid of what people might think about you? Are you afraid that you're not safe, that you're insecure? What is it? Why are you so afraid? He invited the disciples to name it, and I believe that that's the invitation for us too, is to name our fear. So tonight, when you're thinking about the storm that you have been in, that you're maybe walking in right now, hear Jesus say, why are you so afraid? What's underneath that? What's underneath the panic and the anxiety? Why are you so afraid? How is fear driving you to try to problem solve for yourself? Because sometimes our healthy desires can actually lead us to unhealthy coping mechanisms, where we're afraid, and so in order to try to problem solve, then we do things that are actually destructive in the long run, harmful to us, harmful to others. For instance, you may have a fear of being alone, and you desire healthy connection. And that in and of itself is good, but you try to problem solve on your own, and so instead of actually finding the healthy connection through God and God's leading in your life, you're trying to look for connection on screens late at night. And it's leading you to shame and guilt, eating you up. Maybe you fear failure, and you desire to do so well in school and athletics and music. But all of that, then maybe when you take it on your own, then you slide into perfectionism and find your identity in performance, which I understand. Or maybe you fear being rejected, and you desire to be valued by others. But when you take that on your own, then that leads you to throwing out your moral compass and your values, and you just connect with friend groups that you know are not healthy for you because you just so want to be accepted. See, when we try to meet our own needs with our own strength and our own wisdom, it can lead us to unhealth and harm for us and others, and that's where sin enters the picture. See, Jesus takes sin so seriously because he sees that when we try to problem solve on our own and we don't rely on God, but we rely on self, that it really does just cause us hurt and pain and guilt and shame. And that's why Jesus takes it so seriously and says, run away from sin. Let go of the chains. Don't try to do this on your own. I have taken care of this for you. I am with you, and I am enough. God does not want to shame us. But God talks about sin and invites us to wholeness because he wants to free us. And that's exactly what Jesus did on the cross. The greatest storm, the storm of sin and the grip of sin, Jesus took all of that on the cross. And through Jesus' self-sacrificial love and compassion and peace, we are set free because of the death of Jesus on the cross and the resurrection. Jesus conquered the storms of sin. So we don't have to try to problem solve our way to peace, but we can rest and know that we are freed and fulfilled because of Jesus. And this doesn't mean that we will, by the snap of a finger, always have a storm go away. Jesus has conquered the storm of sin, absolutely. But we still live in a world that there is brokenness and pain. But the best news ever is that Jesus is with us in the storms. Jesus doesn't run away from suffering, but runs toward it for our sake. We see that on the cross. So we know that Jesus will continue to run toward suffering, to be with us in the midst of it, to give us peace, even in the storms. If we try to find our faith, and we tie our faith to circumstances and things always going the way that we had planned, that's going to be a roller coaster ride. But when we say, my faith isn't tied to my circumstances always going the way I want, but it's tied to Jesus being with me in my circumstances, we can count on that Jesus is with us and will never fail. We are never alone. And it's the presence of Jesus in the storms that brings us peace. So whatever storm you're facing, whatever hardship you're carrying, hear Jesus tonight say to you, I am right here with you. I'm right here with you in your sadness and grief. I'm right here with you in your confusion. I'm right here with you in your joy. I'm right here with you in your pain. I am right here with you. Hear Jesus say those words to you tonight. And know that it is the presence of Jesus, the one who knows the melodies of our hearts, who can actually continue to shift our perspective and help us live as people of peace in a world that is full of panic. In the 1980s, there was a whale named Humphrey. You may have heard this story before, but Humphrey lived in the San Francisco Bay and was in and out of the Pacific Ocean and in the bay. But there was a time in Humphrey's life where he got a little turned around and a little panicked. And he started to go upstream, up a river, this huge humpback whale. Well, as people in the San Francisco area were watching this happen, they wanted to save Humphrey. They were so worried about him. And so they started getting boats and surrounded him with the boats, trying to turn him around, but it only caused him more panic as he felt cornered and stuck. Then they said, okay, I don't know what else to do. I guess we're going to start banging pipes. So they just bong, 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 banged these pipes over and over all around Humphrey, and this only caused him to feel more in a frenzy. So he kept going up and up the river, and they thought, oh my goodness, we don't know if this whale is going to survive. Well, finally, they had one other idea. And they said, what if we record the sounds of the whales out in the ocean, maybe his friends and family, and they actually put the speakers down in the water in the direction that they want Humphrey to go? What if maybe he'll follow the sounds of the songs of his heart? Well, they did. They put the speakers in the water, and they started playing the songs of the whales, and that helped him turn around. And he started to make his way out of the fresh water, out of the areas that were making him so sick and panicked. And it was the melodies of peace and knowing that he was not alone that brought him out back into the bay. And in the same way, the songs that we each individually need to hear tonight are being sung over us by Jesus. Because we live in a world with a lot of noise that isn't helpful, a lot of messages that cause us to only feel more panicked or try to problem solve our way to peace, that cause us to feel knocked over by the wind of our circumstances and to swim up the wrong streams. But tonight, Jesus is saying, I know the song that your heart needs to hear, and I am singing it over you. Songs of peace. I am with you. We don't serve a God who is far away, but we serve a God who is so close that God sings songs over us. In the book of Zephaniah, chapter 3, verse 17, we read this. For the Lord your God is with you. He is mighty to save. He will take delight in you with gladness. With his love, he will calm your fears. He will rejoice over you with joyful songs. I'm going to read that again, and I invite you to be thinking about the words or the word that you need to hear that is the melody of your heart, the heart cry, the answer to what you're looking for. Hear these words again from Zephaniah 3:17. For the Lord your God is with you. He is mighty to save. He will take delight in you with gladness. With his love, he will calm your fears. He will rejoice over you with joyful songs. For the Lord your God is with you. He is mighty to save. He will take delight in you with gladness. He will calm all your fears, and he will rejoice over you with joyful songs. This is the singing, sleeping in the storm God who holds your face and tenderly says, I am with you, and I'm inviting you to know me. So tonight, in the midst of your storm, in the midst of your fear and anxiety, what would it look like for you to take a step to know Jesus more, to trust him more, to tune your heart to his in ways that maybe you haven't done before? Because peace is available in your boat because of the presence of Jesus, who is the embodiment of peace. Let me pray for you. Jesus, we are so grateful that we are not alone. That in the midst of our storms, in the midst of us feeling afraid and maybe even forgotten, that you have never forgotten us, that you are with us, and that you are inviting us to peace. God, I think about the disciples who were so full of panic and so full of frenzy, and I wonder what would have changed if they would have looked to you first. And seeing that you were asleep and full of peace, what if they would have looked to you first instead of trying to solve the problem on their own? I think that seeing you with them, full of peace, would have changed their perspective of the storm. And so I pray for myself and for my friends here tonight, that you would help us look to you and see you full of peace, you, Jesus, you who are always with us. And I pray too that you would help us take a step to know you more, to rely on you rather than our own perspectives and our own wisdom and our own strength, but that we would say, yes, Jesus, I want to know you more as my friend, my counselor, my comforter, my shield and my defender, and my Prince of Peace. Thank you that you're inviting us to friendship and deeper dependency upon you. And thank you, Jesus, that you are with us, even in the midst of the storms. I pray for myself and for my friends in this room that we would tune our hearts to the melodies that you are singing over us. Thank you that you bring calm to our fears. Would you do that for us tonight? Thank you, Lord. Amen.